With that, I'm going to introduce our first plenary speaker, with Giovanni Circella, who's our director of the Three Revolutions Future Mobility Program. He also moonlights as a senior research engineer in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the Georgia Tech. And of course, Giovanni's research covers the full range of Three Revolutions topics, including transportation services, shared mobility, automated vehicles, and policy analysis. He's led a very robust survey data collection effort from UC Davis, covering the entire globe, garnering a really robust set of data. And he'll be able to share some of the findings from his recent data collection effort today. And so we're thrilled to hear some of those and to talk about the sobering reality of how COVID is affecting our transportation system. So with that, I will leave it to Giovanni to share his screen and start his presentation. So thank you, Giovanni.
Thank you so much, Molly. And thank you for the beautiful introduction. And good morning, everybody. And thanks for joining us for another exciting Three Revolution policy conference. Evidently, the reason we are today connecting through this platform remote and not in person on our beautiful campus at UC Davis is really because we have a pandemic going on. And so today we thought really that I could give a little bit of introductory remarks to this second day of this interesting conference, talking a little bit about what the pandemic means for transportation and the use of various modes, including also some of the three revolutions and how society might be affected in the future because also of the impacts of the pandemic. I will start sharing my screen and hopefully you can see my slides. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see the screen. We are testing this platform for the first time in a big event. We've done some smaller events, so hopefully this works fine now. Anyway, so as Molly mentioned, at UC Davis, we launched a pretty large data collection and a research study in which we're really investigating some of the temporary versus longer term impacts of the pandemic on transportation. And so today I will really dive into some of these topics, or also pointing at what could be only the temporary impacts that the pandemic is having versus some of the longer term consequences that could lead on the future of society. So when we look at the pandemic and what this has caused in the United States as well as all over the world, really we can see that over the past year, transportation has been heavily disrupted. The graph on the left of this slide is taken from passively collected data from Apple. If we use data from Google or from Streetlight or from any other providers, the data are very, very similar. And the trends show that during the early stages of the pandemic, in the United States in March, April last year. But similar patterns have happened in other countries also as they went into the various stages of the pandemic. We have observed a big, steep decline in the use of cars, public transportation, airplanes for long distance travel, pretty much a decline in all the use of all modes, in particular the shared ones. So public transportation, shared mobility, air travel for longer distance and so on. However, what happened after that is that after a few initial months of heavy decline in the use of cars, car travel has recovered fairly strongly. And today we are pretty much at levels which are comparable to those from before the pandemic, which is quite surprising and somehow also concerning if we think that many of us are still working from home, a lot of community trips are down, but there has been some counteracting effects that includes increases in discretionary travel or mode shift from public transportation to car travel for short distance trips or from long distance travel by airplane to cars that somehow have made VNT come back. And so at UC Davis, we were really interested in really to identify who is doing what, also to better understand what are the reasons for which individuals are doing some certain choices, and also what are the likelihood that some of these choices will continue to the future and also might impact the use of transportation in the future, and how also through policy, we might try to reduce some of the negative externalities that the pandemic might cause on society. So at UC Davis, we launched a large mobility study to investigate the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on transportation. And we were somehow lucky, I would say, in a very dramatic time, we were, from a point of view of research, lucky that we could build on previous data collection from before the pandemic, because we had data that we have collected through some large studies in 2018 and 2019. And so we could resample to the extent possible the same respondents, but also we extended the data collection, inviting additional respondents in 15 major metropolitan regions of the United States and 2 in Canada. We also did a convenient sample internationally with more cases, but I will not really touch a lot of the results for the international component of the study today. And we surveyed these respondents during the spring 2020, so the early stages of the pandemic. We surveyed them again in fall 2020, so we have data points for many of these respondents at 3 times before the pandemic, during the first stage of the pandemic, during the second stage of the pandemic in fall. And we are continuing to actually collect data also during spring 2021 and beyond, so we can monitor behaviors, choices, and also intentions to make future changes during the recovery stage, now that the vaccine is available and so on, and also beyond for evaluating also the longer term impacts of the pandemic. And today we don't have the time to go dive into all the details for this project, but for all of those that are interested, I recommend you check our website on the post-COVID-19 mobility.ucdavis.edu, where you can find more details on this research project. So if we look at the data that we collected during this study, pretty much all the various waves of data collection during the pandemic followed a similar structure, in which we collected information about attitudes and preferences for transportation, residential locations, several environmental topics. We collected detailed information about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted lifestyles, household organization, also the use of technology. We collected detailed information about employment status, work, study activities, but also the childcare and the organization of the activities in the household with interaction between different household members. And of course, we collected detailed information about travel choices, but also about behaviors that could substitute for travel, including the use of online shopping, various types of food delivery apps and other services and so on, the use of various types of emerging transportation technologies, and also we focus on the current level of vehicle ownership in the household, but also plans for changing their vehicles, eventually adopting alternative fuel vehicles, varying the number of vehicles in the household, getting rid of a vehicle, purchasing an extra vehicle, and so on. And of course, we have a detailed household in individual social demographics for all members of the households. So in the next few slides, I will just focus on a few selected key findings from this study. And I will start talking about one of the major things that the pandemic has caused on society, which is the tremendous impact on jobs, on the job market and the financial situation, which certainly has been devastating for many Americans, but not for everybody. And so this is very important to consider, because when we look at the financial situation of households that we surveyed during the pandemic, and we're also waiting these data to make them correct for any divergence from the representativeness of the population, we really can see very, very different situations between households that are not particularly concerned about their monthly bills, and even during the pandemic, they've been doing quite well, versus individuals that have been really hit very hard during the pandemic. And this includes predominantly individuals which are in lower income households, and they were really already sometimes financially struggling before, but the pandemic is actually exacerbating these equity gaps. And if we look at the impacts of employment, the situation has similar impacts, but even more dramatic ones, because we see that individuals in low-income households and low-income workers are more likely to belong to groups that have either lost their job, they've been furloughed without pay for at least part of the time during the pandemic, or maybe they were working for a place of employment that has run out of business during the pandemic. Well, among those that still have a job, we see that, of course, many of us, we have switched to remote working, so we work from home. And I always like to say that we are the privileged somehow. We still have a job, we can work from home, so somehow, we've been less affected by the pandemic. But the reality is that the situation, it's not the same for everybody. There is a ceiling of probably, according to statistics, 35% of workers that can work efficiently from home. Others need to report to work. In California, it's probably a little bit more because of the high-tech industry in the Silicon Valley, Northern California in particular. And if we look at the distribution by various income tax categories, we see that the differences are striking. So when we look at the higher income categories, we see a massive shift of individuals that were telecommuting 0 times a week before the pandemic. And now in our longitudinal data, we see that they have actually gone up to telecommute 5 times or more during the week. On the other end of the spectrum, lower income households, they are reporting that their workers, they tend to still telecommute today 0 times a week. A lot of them are still in the category that they cannot really telecommute. And in other parts of the data that I'm not reporting today, we can see that those that are more in labor, working class groups, there are blue collar workers and so on, are much more likely to report that they are essential workers and they need to show up in person for their job and cannot really telecommute. So big changes and big differences in across different income groups. When we look at another type of technology, some of us call it the fourth revolution. So everything that has to do with ICT and technology and also e-shopping, well, we see also that this has been really changing in the patterns of adoption during the pandemic. What we see in our data is that we can call it the democratization of e-shopping. So somehow e-shopping, from being a phenomenon that was more predominantly used among urban users, younger individuals, and so on, is now being adopted by broader groups of users, including also elderly people, people that don't live in urban areas, and so on. Although we still see some income-based gaps because lower income households are still lagging behind in the adoption of e-shopping. At the same time, we can say that what we are observing is probably just an acceleration of a phenomenon that was happening already from the past. So probably this is a longer-term impact of the pandemic. E-shopping was already growing before the pandemic, and this increase in the base of users using e-shopping is probably here to stay, because once people adopt a certain new technology and they like it and see the benefits, they will likely continue to do that. On the other end of the spectrum, we see the food delivery apps, Uber Eats, and all the other services that are delivering meals and opportunities to get, like, your food delivered to your home. These have seen like a big uptick during the pandemic. But if we see who are the users, predominantly they tend to be still younger, urban, dynamic segments of the population. And in a lot of cases, these are the same people that have actually reduced their visits to restaurants. And so somehow, like, by the time these individuals return to restaurants, we probably think that the least part of this uptick might be considered temporary. Another topic I want to mention is the use of shared mobility. So if we look at ride-hailing, for example, we see that, of course, the ride-hailing industry was devastated during the pandemic. The Uber pool and Lyft share options were completely withdrawn because of the need for social distancing, but even the single user type of service has declined considerably. But even here, if we look at differences by income groups, we see a lot of differences in the decline that was made in the use of these services. In particular, if you look at high-income users, there were those that were using the service more often in the past. In our longitudinal data, we can see a big, very, very sharp decline in the use of these services. But when we look at the lower income users, some very interesting findings are found, because a lot of users are actually maintaining their use more or less similar to what they were doing before the pandemic. Sure, there was a decline, but the decline was much less steep than what observed in the other categories. And this is clearly also because of, from the other answers that we get in our data collection, because some of these users, they have limited access to other mobility options, but also ride-hailing and shared mobility has provided somehow an alternative to the use of public transportation and to reach facilities where they need to go and for essential workers, so somehow fulfilling a role that is pretty important in society. Another topic, and it's the last one I will touch today, we don't have a lot of time for other topics, is really the potential for increased car dependency in society. This is a little bit concerning. We see that a substantial portion of survey respondents reported they are interested in increasing vehicle ownership in the near future. This somehow is matching the reports in car sales, especially in the second part of 2020. And we see, like, decline in the number of users that are interested in adopting a car-light, a more multimodal type of lifestyles in their life. So moving forward from here, certainly, this data and this study is exploring a lot of directions of how transportation is being reshaped in society. And an additional few things that I want also to mention is that not only demand is changing, but also the supply is changing. And this somehow, the two things are interacting somehow, because they will shape the future of transportation together. So for example, we see changes in supply with the mergers and acquisition processes of some companies that are merging, like is happening in the micromobility space with the Jump division from Uber and Lime that merged during the pandemic. We see the cities are changing, reclaiming some space from cars, providing more space for bicyclists, and all these will have likely some opportunities also for policy to affect demand and use of transportation in the future. I don't want to take much more time on this. I will just mention, I think I already touched some equity issues of the pandemic. I will just mention very quickly some environmental impacts that are rather concerning that we need to think about. Not only the increase in discretionary trips or trips made by car, but also some mode shift from public transportation to using private cars. In the long distance travel, we see shifts happening from airline trips to car trips. And somehow, all these sum up with a change in supply, including also the difficulties that many transit operators are having right now with the reduced budget, reduced revenues, might point to some potentially concerning environmental impacts. Of course, unless we develop the proper policies to ensure sustainability of transportation in the future. And so I will really pause here. A lot of people are asking me, will we go back to previous life? Certainly there are some things that seems to be here to stay, like the increase in e-shopping, and some of these things are here, but also we know that the literature has been telling us already in the past that the longer a disruption is, the more likely that some more longer term impacts will remain. And so usually after the disruption is removed, people go back to their previous behaviors, but now we've been already altering our behaviors for a year. And this is something that could leave longer term impacts. Other things to consider, the concern about sharing modes, the supply will change and the big important role of policies. And also, I think we will really need to think very carefully about equity implications. And I will not talk a lot about land use today and residential location. I think it's probably too early to talk about that, but maybe in the question and answer time, if there are questions about these, we can discuss more about the potential changes in the real estate market and housing and how society could be reshaped in the longer term. I will pause here with a big acknowledgement for the big research team working on these topics. There are many more colleagues and students working also with us. So probably here is only a partial picture of our participants and collaborators on this project. And Molly, I will get back to you. I think probably we have 4 or 5 minutes for question and answers.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much, Giovanni. It's really interesting, to hear. To put some numbers to what we probably assumed was happening, but it's really good to see, what is truly happening. So I think the question I have for you is, which you did touch on, so please, I just want to expand it briefly, is about policy. So what can be done here? Where do you see a role for, I think I'd like to focus on, to some extent, local policy. So local, what can cities do to respond to the pandemic and ensure that as people move back to, life more prior to the pandemic, what can they do to make sure that we don't see the environmental and societal impacts that we fear?
Well, it's an excellent question, Molly, and I think there are a number of things that could be done. Certainly, there is a concern that we could have increased car dependence in the near future in society, and this is something that we should really think carefully about how can be counteracted. One of the silver lining, I would say, that we are observing in our data and is consistent with other data collections that are happening in around the country, in other countries around the world, is that people as somehow adopted active modes of transportation more recently. And this is very important in the local level that you mentioned. We see an uptick in walking and bicycling for both recreational purposes, but also for moving around in cities. And some cities have already been promoting that increase in the bike lanes, space, bike infrastructure, but also on the incentive side, especially in Europe and other parts of the world, we're seeing very strong incentives to purchase bikes, purchase electric bikes which research is showing can be also useful to go longer distances, because usually, like, individuals on the bike, they don't really go very long distances. The trips are rather short. But if you move into the electric bikes or the personally on e-scooters, and we provide, like, on the same time, the opportunity to use these in cities because it's safer, and we have a protected space where to use this infrastructure. But also we have a system on the privately owned side, incentives to purchase these this type of modes of transportation and these vehicles. But also, like, on the share modes, better integration also with more coordination with public transportation. And when we restart using public transportation more, right now the ridership is very low. We've been talking with several rail operators in California. They're telling us ridership currently is about 15% of where it was before the pandemic. These are data from the Capital Corridor in Northern California. So we're talking about 85% of the ridership is gone. And of course, part of this will come back, but there is a concern that some of these might not come back, especially because some of these might continue to telecommute and so on. So we really need to think about ways we can promote public transportation, integrate public transportation with first last mile access, a lot of the things that were the topics from before the pandemic, but also now they have a different angle because there is even more importance to promoting shared electric mobility that can lead to more sustainable solutions.
Exactly. Thank you. That's. I think the next question I'll ask is to tee up our next session, which is a big topic. We're really focusing on both electrification and shared mobility, looking at that nexus where you can see reducing greenhouse gas emissions per passenger mile, reducing impact of our travel choices. So I know. So how does your work connect to that discussion, and where do you see? So just help us draw the thread between the COVID-related research and this broader effort to move towards more climate safe and secure transportation.
Absolutely, and I will try to answer this question more, also merging perhaps another question that I see in the chat box from John Bosel that is asking about the VMT that is rebounding, but at the same time congestion is lower than pre-pandemic, and so what is happening? So certainly, like, this is a time to coordinate the post-pandemic future and the future of transportation with the research about the 3R, all the solutions that technology can provide to provide cleaner, better transportation, more sustainable transportation. And also, this is also something related not only for the environmental issues, but also for congestion release efforts. So from that side, I would say that the congestion is lower, even if VMT is up, because we are seeing at the moment a reduction in number of commuting trips because people are more telecommuting, but also counterbalancing increase in discretionary trips. And this happens many times more towards the middle part of the day. So somehow the gap that we usually have between the peak time and the off-peak time, which is much lower, is getting lower because both sides of the distribution are getting closer to each other, an increase in the off-peak trips and a decrease in the peak time. And so this is certainly leading to a little bit less congestion on our roads because most of the congestion happens in this part where we have the peak time. So that's somehow something a little bit better during the pandemic. The problem is that a lot of the trips that happen during the discretionary trips and the off-peak time are made by car. And so they tend to be more polluting, they tend to have more impacts in terms of impacts on the environment. And so that is really where we need to work more. Probably we don't have more time to elaborate further, but I think it's really something where we see the connection between climate-related research, the post-pandemic research, and the 3R that can give a big input. I would say the 4R, with also ICT, information communication technology, that is really reshaping.
There's so much. There's so many good options for a fourth R, right? And you've mentioned in the past that e-shopping should be the fourth revolution as well, which we'll also cover later today. And I know there's a question on that, but we'll have to take that later today because we are going to be talking about the impacts of e-shopping. So I'm going to clear those questions, and you can incorporate them into our next session. So if you go to the chat, you'll notice that there is a Slido. I want to thank Giovanni, so much for your presentation, and of course for all this research. It's really extremely valuable, and we really appreciate you sharing it today. So thank you again, Giovanni.